Capita envisions a future in which families and communities can flourish. By prioritizing families and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita and Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to craft effective policies for a future in which families and their communities can flourish. In this episode, Capita's Chief Strategy Officer, Cassidy, speaks with Katie King, Senior Director of Strategic Engagement at KnowledgeWorks. They discuss a 10-year forecast co-developed by Capita and KnowledgeWorks in 2019 about the key issues impacting children and families in the U.S. The episode discusses the pandemic's impact, including mental health and strain on caregiving, plus the rise of homeschooling and the increasing effects of climate change. They explore surprising trends like AI and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, as well as complexities of children's autonomy and equity. Looking forward, they highlight key trends to watch: climate change, social justice, AI, parental support, and declining child mortality rates. The episode concludes with a discussion on the value of strategic foresight tools for navigating uncertain futures.
Capita explores the major transformations of our time and anticipates their potential impacts on families and their communities worldwide. Today, I am delighted to talk to Katie King, Senior Director of Strategic Engagement at KnowledgeWorks and a long-term friend and collaborator of Capita. In 2019, Katie and KnowledgeWorks and Capita co-developed the first ever 10-year forecast, looking at the key trends and issues that could affect the flourishing of children and their families over the next decade. Well, we're halfway through that decade now, and in just 5 years, we've seen a world transformed by a whole host of events and crises, or, as we often refer to it at Capita, the age of unraveling. The forecast itself focuses on 5 key areas: health, learning, autonomy, social structures, and caregiving. It explores questions around what care means in our society and its value, how to balance stability, flexibility, and innovation, the role of autonomy and also over-monitoring, inclusion and equity, collaboration around different systems, disciplines, and generations, and the role of technology in supporting or hindering flourishing. So today I'm talking to Katie about some of these issues and trends. There are many, and obviously we can't go through all of them, but we want to look at sort of some of the key ones that stand out to her, as well as what has unfolded since, what surprised us, and how these changes are shaping the future and flourishing of families and their communities as we head into the next 5 years. Katie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Caroline. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be with you.
So, I know there's so much that we could talk about today if we started digging right into the forecast and all the different dimensions of it. But I wanted to start really by talking about the 5 domains that you identified. Which do you think has had the most significant impact on children and families over the past 5 years, and why?
Sure. So the two that stand out to me, both as areas where there's been a lot of movement, a lot of conversation, a lot of attention, and also where there remains a lot of uncertainty, which when we have uncertainty, that means that there are opportunities, and that means that there's challenge, and there are a lot of elements that we don't yet know how they'll play out. But the two that stand out to me, one is the stretched social fabric domain, and really thinking about as family structures shift, as society changes, how can we ensure that families and individuals within families have the formal and informal support structures that they need? And that's some of what we explored in the forecast. And I think that we've just seen time and time again the support structures for families and being inadequate to meet the needs of our current life and era. And the other domain, care at the core. So thinking about caregiving, and again, as we're seeing economic and social shifts, and as the population continues to age, how do we address caregiving? It is this timeless, age-old need, and yet we have emerging needs within this area. And how can we do that in a way that is dignified and workable for everyone involved? There are so many different angles to look at caregiving. There are there's the caregiving workforce, there are families, there are the people who are being cared for, and all of them have different interests, and there's society at large as well, which obviously has a huge stake in how we handle caregiving. And sometimes it can feel like all of those interests are competing. We've seen so many ideas and experiments and tests of different ideas of how we might make our caregiving structures more sustainable and more workable for more people. And I think we still haven't quite figured that out and still have a great deal of work to do on that in the future. But those are the two that stood out to me when I look back and think these feel really like they have been very important in the last 5 years and will continue to be in the 5 years and beyond.
Of course, you touched on uncertainties, and the forecast says the 10-year horizon is full of changes and uncertainties that have the potential to disrupt family life as we know it today, right? Of course, a lot has changed in 5 years. Could you just talk a little bit about some of those changes since the forecast's release and kind of the impacts that's had?
I mean, I think for young children and families in particular, for all of us, but, being a parent of young children, I can say that the pandemic and its effects still loom very large. We really can't talk about what has happened in the last 5 years without beginning with that event and series of events and all the ripple effects that have come from it, how it accelerated certain trends that were already underway and really laid bare some of the difficult truths about our society. We saw ourselves in stark relief in some ways. I mean, just to name a few of those: mental health and social emotional health of young people and parents, cost of living changes, increases, a severely strained and overworked teaching and caregiving workforce, people opting out of formal education structures, increases in homeschooling and other kind of alternative schooling structures, and really revealing the absolute necessity of community and social support structures, and unfortunately the inadequacy of what we have in place in those areas. So I think all of those things were not necessarily new, and the pandemic highlighted them and accelerated them in certain ways. On the flip side, though, I also think that for a brief moment, the pandemic let us test and examine and explore some alternative assumptions about how things could be and how we might support children and families. I think another element that has changed, climate change, obviously a very long running trend, but more and more climate related disasters that of course are affecting young children and families, really threatening their stability, interrupting learning, raising health concerns, both physical and mental. And so I think that's just something that we've continued to see more and more of in the last 5 years.
And we were just chatting as well, weren't we, about some of the things that have taken us by surprise recently, particularly with the climate crisis. So some of the recent flooding in France, where I am, or hurricanes in the Carolinas, or fires in California, and these sort of unprecedented changes and therefore impacts to whole communities and obviously children and families. Katie, have any emerging trends over the last 5 years caught you by surprise, either in a positive or a concerning way?
So what's interesting about trends is that they, by definition, a trend is change over time. And so we can always trace back kind of seeing that they started some time ago, but they can feel sudden and they can feel surprising because they don't progress on this linear or uniform timeline. They may plod along for a while and then things snowball and it can feel like something happened out of nowhere. The climate events that you just mentioned are perfect examples. We've known that we're on this trajectory, but something big and sudden happens and it can feel overwhelming, even if cognitively we've known that things like this are coming. So I think the couple that come to mind are not surprising in their existence so much as exactly how and when they have accelerated and suddenly felt like a huge part of our lives. So the two I'll name that I think fit the bill most recently are kind of this era of AI that we find ourselves in, artificial intelligence. Generative AI tools are now accessible to anyone in the world and are increasingly being incorporated into official decision-making processes of all kinds. And obviously development of and thinking around AI has been around for decades and decades. But we hit this point of accessibility and ubiquity more recently that obviously has a lot of implications at the social and individual levels for children and families. And the other is, I think, the fall of Roe versus Wade is a punctuation mark on a long-term effort to roll back autonomy and rights around childbearing. Obviously, that movement against reproductive rights is not new, but that big event certainly influences futures for children and families.
Yeah. And so thinking a bit more actually about autonomy there, I wanted to actually look a little bit more at that in terms of children's autonomy and how that is related also to equity, right? You talk about that dimension a fair bit in the forecast. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how you think that area has progressed or faced challenges?
So I'll say that that domain was the most challenging one to write. We knew that we had something important to say about decision making and voice and how that relates to children and equity. But I just remember it being a very challenging concept to articulate. And I don't know that I have my arms much more wrapped around it now than I did then, but I'm going to try because I think it remains a really critical issue to think about. So in the forecast, we pointed to increasing acceptability of children expressing opinions and having a say about what they need, who they are, and in general, what happens to them, that they're more involved in that process. And if we believe, as I believe and Capita believes, that children are full human beings, they're not just adults in training, that their lives are affected by the world we live in, then that idea makes a lot of sense, that they should be involved in those kinds of processes. But we also said in the forecast that we need some frameworks for how children are involved in issues and in conversation, how we talk to children about real and difficult things. We can't just plop them down in the middle of a conversation about the challenges of the world. We can't just expect them to independently explore their own identities. They need support from adults to be able to explore themselves, explore and understand the world. So it's this really nuanced thing, and we tried to capture that.
You also talked a bit about the optimization of childhood, right? So there's the autonomy of childhood, but then there was also the optimization of it. So this area particularly interests me. Last year, I wrote a piece that was actually specifically looking at how much parents and caregivers feel that they have to optimize their children, almost a bit like these Tamagotchi pets, right? If you just do it in a specific way and work hard enough about it and you do it, then you'll have this almost, this perfect child for the future, right? But of course, as anyone who's a caregiver or a parent will know, right? Children are not these sort of fixed beings, and certainly the caregivers aren't either. Could you talk to me a bit more about that dimension and where you think we might be headed?
So one of the ideas that we explored in the forecast was through an artifact. And artifacts from the future are images, they're objects, they're places, they're things that exist in the future. And we imagine them to try to help make a future world more tangible and understand what might actually exist in that world. And so we imagine something called InvisiSafe. And it is this virtual perimeter around a neighborhood or a space. And so the idea is that within this perimeter, children have ultimate freedom to roam and play and be kids. But there is this boundary that parents can monitor. They can know exactly where the child is within the boundary. They can ensure that that child is never going to cross that boundary unless they know about it. And so it's very highly monitored, but there is this sense of freedom, and there is this belief that there's freedom within the boundaries. And we were really intentional with that artifact because we noticed this tension, and I think this tension has only increased in the last 5 years, between parents realizing that children do need to be children and wanting to give them freedom to play, not wanting to overstructure their time. There is that sense that we need to be doing it differently in terms of how children are spending time and kind of how much control adults have over that. And yet, it's very challenging to actually let go and allow that to happen for cultural reasons, for reasons of the state of the world and anxiety about what could happen. All of that makes it hard to really allow children to be children in whatever way that might happen. And so I think that tension exists. I feel it in my own life, and I see it in friends. We really want to value who our children are now and give them experiences that are purely just for joy and their exploration. And yet there's this pull towards optimization, towards making sure that things are in service of something, or just making sure that we can control the situation more in a way that feels more safe. And so I think that challenging that over optimization was something that we named in the forecast. I think it's still something that we absolutely have to be attentive to, because I said, even those of us who really from a value standpoint believe that childhood is a rich and valuable time in its own, completely separate from how it might be supporting young people in developing as adults, it's very hard to resist all of the forces that are pushing and telling us that's not okay. No, it has to be. It's unsafe to allow children to participate in the world this way, or need to be optimizing this time. And I think one of the areas where we can make progress in this issue is just noticing how we're talking about the way children spend their time and the way that we are just thinking about those things. Like, are we always talking about things in terms of how they will serve them later in life? Or are we really prioritizing what is meaningful and valuable and enriching to them right now, today, who they are? And if we can make those subtle shifts, I think we can begin to notice more of those places where we may be moving into that optimization territory, when we really may want to be more in the organic, free development territory.
Are there any new trends that you're seeing emerge in the work that you're doing that you think we need to keep an eye on? So thinking ahead for the next 5 or 10 years or even beyond.
Yeah, futurist Leah Zadie says that really the three trends we need to be focused on, and these are not new, but I offer it because I think that it is. If you only have time to think about three trends, be paying attention to climate change, the ongoing work to create a more just and free society, and the rise of artificial intelligence. In terms of some other ones that are shifting or that we're looking at, and I think Capita is also really paying close attention to this idea of parental support and creating connections, parents feeling connected to each other, to society, to something larger, and kind of how that relates to family structure. So we see we named in the forecast that people were citing expense of children as a reason to not have children. Increasingly since then, more people are saying because they're afraid of the state of the environment and climate change is a reason that people are not having children. That's shifting family structures and also just shifting the kind of mindset that people are going into parenthood with. They may still decide to have children, but they are coming with this base level of anxiety about the future. And that really has an impact on the way that families function and the kinds of supports that people need. There was some interesting figures that came out of a Pew Research report that parents are spending more time with their children, but a lot still feel like there's not enough time. They're spending more time with their children. They're spending more time working, so more time doing everything, and it still doesn't feel like enough. So just kind of understanding where that's coming from and what sort of supports parents and caregivers need to kind of stabilize their sense of their own contributions to their families. And mental health of parents and caregivers, I think, is another huge issue. You all funded a study on loneliness, and I noticed that I think it was 43% of parents with children 0 to 5 are experiencing anxiety. And so there's just a lot going on in family structures that are asking us to look at how we're supporting parents and caregivers in different ways, and then what kinds of connections need to be built. I read an article that there's been an uptick in the number of relatively younger men in the US joining the Freemasons because they're looking for connection. They're looking for a group of people to be a part of. And as we've seen decline of some of those social spaces, places where people might have found that over time, what kind of resurgence might we see of other kinds of groups popping up or people going back to other types of social connection that they may have had in previous generations. So I think just that whole idea of how our parents and caregivers experiencing parenthood and caregiving and what are the supports available for them, I think is something to watch over time.
Katie, I would love to keep talking sort of all day with you about all this stuff because, as we said, the forecast has just got so many different layers to it and so much is still so relevant. But I just wanted to finish really by just talking about the foresight tools, right, that you use in your work, we use in our work, and this sort of whole idea of strategic foresight, which is this discipline that investigates and looks at possibilities for the future and supports those that are using it look at how they can chart those possibilities and think of informed paths forward. Obviously, this is all part of our broader thinking around building social imagination in our societies and really allowing people to think through different futures, especially in these uncertain times right now. What do you see as the top 3 benefits of using strategic foresight tools in guiding organizations through uncertain futures?
Yes. And I could talk about this all day, so I'm going to try to few. I'll give you my 3 reasons, and I do need to give a little explanation of them. But I'll start with the 3, and then go a little bit deeper into them, hopefully making some connections between them. So I think the first reason is that strategic foresight tools and futures thinking tools help us make calculated assumptions about the future, which can lead to creating more robust and resilient plans. These tools also help build our comfort with uncertainty, which allows us to be more agile and adaptable to changing conditions. And as you mentioned, they help us engage our imagination, which can lead us to bold and transformative visions. So I'll go into each of those a little bit more deeply. So one of the basic tenets of futures thinking is there are no facts from the future. Every thought, idea we have about the future is an assumption. Some of them may be very safe assumptions of what's going to happen tomorrow, maybe even next year. Some of them are less safe assumptions, but they are all assumptions. And assumption is often treated as a bad word. It is not a bad word in this context. If we did not make assumptions about the future, we would be overwhelmed by the range of possibilities. So we have to do it. What we can do is make more calculated, informed assumptions about the future and be more explicit about them. Organizations are often talking about what they want to happen, their preferred future. That's great. We should continue to do that. But we also need to be talking about, okay, well, what do we think is going to happen? What are our expectations? And let's surface those among all the people that we're working with. Because if I'm working with you and we're developing strategy, and I don't know what you actually think is going to happen 10 years from now, or what the future is going to be like, and we don't have shared assumptions about that, we're going to be working on 2 different planes. So I think that's a really important conversation. And even more important than that, the conversation that very few organizations are having is what else might happen instead. So we maybe talk about what we want to happen, what we think will happen, but what else might happen instead? What are those other possibilities for the future that may not be front of mind? They may not be things we want to happen. They may not even be things that feel particularly plausible, but they are possibilities. And so let's put them out on the table and let's think about what they might be. And then we can develop plans based on that range and say, well, what can we do that's going to help us navigate any of these possibilities to get closer to what we want? So we're always making assumptions about the future. Strategic foresight tools can help us make calculated assumptions about the future and actually recognize that we're making assumptions instead of just going forward without even really talking about what we think is going to happen. And I think that the second point about building comfort with uncertainty, the funny thing is the more time you spend thinking about the future, the less you feel like you know about it. which is a good thing because it is uncertain. If we felt really certain about the future, then we are absolutely going to be overwhelmed with surprise when we find out that what we thought was going to happen is not actually coming to pass. So if we can get comfortable with uncertainty, spend more time with, I'm not sure, but here are possibilities, let's talk them out, then I think that allows us to be more adaptable when change does occur. And it also allows us to approach change from a place of curiosity instead of one of fear. And using these tools, I think, just builds that comfort and builds that muscle of sitting with the fact that we don't know. And then the last one is around engaging our imaginations. And I think a lot of people would say that feels kind of fluffy and that would be nice. I actually think it's absolutely critical. Everything that we have, every system that we live in is an idea. And we live in it because at least enough people believe that is the way that it should exist, that we've bought into it. And we are often so constrained by what exists right now that we feel like it's non-negotiable. But can we engage our imaginations and think of something different? One of my favorite futurists, Adrienne Marie Brown, says, I often feel as if I'm trapped in someone else's imagination and I need to engage my own imagination in order to break free. We are right now living in systems and in a society that is a set of ideas. And can we break out of those and come up with new, very different ideas? If we're hoping to live in a future that's very different than the present, we first have to be able to imagine what that would be like. And without futures thinking tools, I think often our visions or our ideas of how things could or should be in the future are still very constrained by what we know today or what we've experienced in the past. So I think these tools can help us expand our imaginations and really, truly think of possibilities that are different from what we're experiencing today.
That's a really great way to end. Thank you so much for talking to me today. Been a really great conversation. I'm looking forward to picking it up offline as well. Lots more to go with this. Have a great rest of the day and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.